Dawn, June 6, 1944. The sky above Normandy hung low and colorless, the air thick with salt and smoke. From the ridge overlooking Colleville-sur-Mer, German sentries of the 352nd Infantry Division peered through rangefinders, their eyes raw from sleepless nights and sea spray. What they saw at first seemed like a mirage, black dots on a grey horizon swelling into shapes that churned the surf. Then the horizon erupted. Battleship shells screamed overhead, shaking the soil beneath their boots. The men ducked instinctively as thunder rolled from the channel and geysers of sand and steel ripped open their fortifications. When the haze cleared for a heartbeat, the truth revealed itself. The sea was alive with landing craft. Hundreds of them. Through the drifting smoke, dark silhouettes began to move ashore. One officer shouted in disbelief. Tanks emerging from the surf. M4 Shermans, the workhorses of the Allied armies, were crawling out of the sea like beasts reborn from fire and salt. Some burned where they struck hidden mines, black plumes twisting into the sky. Others pressed forward, treads grinding against wet sand, hulls battered but unbroken. To the Germans it defied logic. Panzers were miles inland. No armor should have survived the crossing. Yet the Shermans came in waves, their machine guns spitting fire across the beach. Veterans of the Eastern Front who had faced Soviet swarms now felt a different kind of dread, an enemy as methodical as it was relentless. As the tide swallowed their trenches and radio lines fell silent, the defenders of Colleville realized this was not a raid. It was the opening of a storm that would break the Atlantic Wall itself. Behind those steel machines stood an entire industrial empire, and the ridge that once commanded the beach was about to become its first graveyard, or its first conquest. The story now turns back to the beginning, to the forges and factories where these machines of liberation were born. The story of the Sherman began not on the battlefield, but in the boardrooms and foundries of 1941 America, when the world teetered on the brink of total war and the U.S. Army faced a grim truth. Its armored forces were obsolete. The tanks that had rolled through maneuvers in Louisiana were undergunned and underpowered, relics beside the swift German Panzers that had conquered Europe. What the United States needed was not merely a tank but a vision, a machine that could be built fast, repaired easily, and shipped anywhere in the world. From this demand emerged the medium tank M4, soon to bear the name of a Civil War general whose campaigns embodied mobility and endurance, William Tecumseh Sherman. Weighing roughly 30 tons and armed with a 75mm M3 gun, the first Shermans rolled out of the assembly lines in late 1941. Their rounded turrets, welded hulls and gasoline engines gave them a distinctive profile, simple, functional and efficient. On paper, they were outmatched by the heavier German Tigers and Panthers that would appear later, but the Sherman's genius lay not in raw strength. It was a soldier's tank, fast, forgiving and easy to maintain in the field. With a top speed of 25 miles per hour and a range exceeding 120 miles, it could maneuver through deserts, forests, and ruined towns with equal ease. Its baptism came in North Africa in late 1942, when British 8th Army crews first took the M4 into battle at El Alamein in Tunisia. Mechanics marveled at how it started after long nights in desert cold, and commanders praised how easily damaged parts could be replaced. The tank proved that reliability could be as deadly as armor. But even as it triumphed beneath the African sun, planners in Washington and London were already dreaming beyond the desert, to the beaches of France. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Lima roared day and night, producing thousands each month. Special variants appeared, amphibious duplex-drive Shermans fitted with canvas skirts and propellers, others with deep wading trunks and hedgerow cutters welded to their bows. The Sherman was no longer just a tank. It had become the symbol of industrial willpower, a weapon forged not for duels but for liberation. Its story was about to cross the sea, where design would meet destiny on the shores of Normandy. By the spring of 1944, the Sherman was no longer just a weapon. It was an industrial phenomenon. Across the United States, the thunder of machinery echoed from dawn to dusk and far into the night. In Detroit, the Chrysler Arsenal tank plant stretched over 1 million square feet, its roof glimmering with floodlights even at midnight. Trains arrived hourly with steel plates, engines, and turret rings. Within days, those raw materials emerged as complete tanks. painted, tested, and ready for war. On an average day, 25 new Shermans rolled off a single assembly line. Across the nation, dozens of plants, Fisher Body in Cleveland, Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, contributed to a production miracle that fulfilled President Roosevelt's promise of an arsenal of democracy. By the end of 1944, more than 49,000 Shermans had been built, each a 30-ton symbol of American industry's capacity to outproduce tyranny. Where Germany's factories crafted a few dozen tanks with exquisite precision, America produced hundreds with mechanical uniformity. The Sherman was designed for quantity, without sacrificing reliability. Its standardized parts meant a transmission from Ohio could fit a tank assembled in California. An engine built in Detroit could replace one destroyed in Normandy. Behind the armored flood stood a vast logistical web, Liberty ships loading tanks at Baltimore and New York, convoys crossing the Atlantic under destroyer escort, and British ports swelling with armor that seemed to multiply by the week. In southern England, rail depots and hedgerow camps became steel forests. Mechanics tuned engines beneath camouflage nets, while engineers fitted each tank with deep wading kits for the coming invasion. German aerial reconnaissance noted the build-up, but misread its meaning. Analysts in occupied France assumed these vehicles were part of a diversion, a feint, perhaps toward Norway or the Pas-de-Calais. They could not imagine that such numbers could be real. Yet the truth waited across the Channel. When the grey light of June 6th broke over Normandy, the product of America's industrial heartland would roar ashore. The tide of steel was no longer theoretical. It was coming, and it would not stop. In the winter of 1944, as Allied planners shaped the final blueprint for the invasion of France, a single question haunted every briefing. How could tanks, machines of land and steel, cross the sea? The answer emerged not from America, but from Britain's restless engineers under Major General Percy Hobart, a man famous for transforming impossible ideas into battlefield reality. His team of inventors and mechanics, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, set out to create a tank that could swim. The result was the Sherman duplex drive, an ordinary M4 turned amphibious through equal parts ingenuity and audacity. The design looked almost absurd. A collapsible canvas screen wrapped around the hull like a giant rubber skirt, held upright by metal struts and inflated by compressed air. Beneath the waterline, two propellers linked to the tank's drive shaft pushed it forward at about 4 knots. To steer, the driver used a lever system that controlled the tracks, allowing the tank to swim from landing craft to shore. The engine was waterproofed, exhaust pipes extended into tall trunks and every hatch sealed tight. Once the tank reached the beach, the canvas screen could be dropped within seconds, and the Sherman would fight as normal, its 75mm gun ready to blast open German defenses. Training began in secret, along the windswept lochs of Scotland and the southern coasts of England. Crews of the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions spent endless hours launching their swimming Shermans into choppy water, learning to handle the sluggish controls and balance the buoyant screens in storm-like conditions. Many remained skeptical. Even in calm seas, the margin for error was razor-thin. A tear in the canvas or an unexpected swell could doom the entire crew. Yet optimism prevailed. Commanders believed that armored support in the first minutes of the landings would make the difference between chaos and victory. Across the Channel, the Germans fortified their beaches with concrete bunkers, mines and artillery, trusting the sea itself as an ally. They had no idea that Allied engineers had turned water into a weapon. On the morning of June 6th, those impossible machines would rise from the waves, challenging not only German defenses, but the very laws of war. At 6:30 a.m., the grey dawn over Normandy shattered into chaos. The tide ran high, the surf heavy with whitecaps and smoke, and the wind tore at the canvas screens of the duplex-drive Shermans. From their landing craft miles offshore, crews of the 741st Tank Battalion could barely see the French coast, a jagged line of cliffs and concrete under constant bombardment. Then came the order, launch. One by one, the amphibious tanks slid into the Channel. For a moment they bobbed, awkward but afloat. Then the sea turned against them. The waves rose too high, flooding the fragile flotation skirts. Radios crackled with panic, as one after another vanished beneath the water. Out of 32 Shermans launched by the 741st, only 3 reached Omaha Beach. The rest lay silent under the waves, their crews entombed in steel coffins before the battle even began, but the survivors refused to die quietly. Those few tanks that made it ashore, alongside the hardier vehicles of the 743rd Tank Battalion, rolled straight into the storm. German MG-42s scythed across the sand, cutting down infantry by the dozens. Yet through the smoke came the low mechanical roar of the Shermans. Their tracks dug deep into wet sand, their 75mm guns firing point-blank into concrete embrasures. Sergeant Clarence McGowan's tank reportedly destroyed 3 bunkers in 10 minutes, each shot clearing a pocket of resistance where soldiers had been pinned. For the infantry of the 1st and 29th Divisions, those tanks became the only moving cover on the beach, a lifeline of armor in a world of fire. Further west at Utah Beach, the sea was calmer. The 4th Infantry Division landed with nearly all its DD Shermans intact. Their arrival turned the landing zone from a killing ground into a corridor of advance. German officers of the 352nd Division, monitoring the chaos from inland positions, could scarcely believe the reports coming in. Panzerabwehr, tanks in the surf, one message read in disbelief. For men hardened on the Eastern Front, the sight of American armor rising from the ocean seemed like madness, but it was no illusion. By mid-morning, Sherman tracks were grinding up the bluffs of Normandy, crushing wire and concrete alike. The myth of the Atlantic Wall, Fortress Europe's unbreakable shield, was already crumbling beneath their treads. What began as survival on the beach would soon become the momentum of liberation. From the cliffs above Omaha, the first German observers could scarcely believe what they were seeing. The sea, once trusted as their strongest ally, had betrayed them. Waves of olive-drab armor were emerging through the mist, crawling out of the surf under relentless naval shellfire. In the log of the 352nd Infantry Division, a terse line captured the disbelief of the moment. Enemy armor appeared from the sea, impossible under such fire. Officers peering through periscopes mistook the duplex-drive Shermans for amphibious armored cars or strange landing craft. Others called them schwimmende Särge, floating coffins, certain they would sink before reaching shore. Yet there they were, climbing the sandbanks, firing as they came. At WN-62, one of the most heavily fortified strongpoints above Colleville-sur-Mer, Lieutenant Fritz Fröking's men watched the tanks advance through smoke and tide. They fired everything they had, machine guns, mortars, 88mm shells, but the range was collapsing too fast. Shells bounced off the wet sand and detonated beneath their own positions, shaking the bunkers from below. The explosions felt unnatural, as if the ground itself had turned against them. Survivors later recalled that each tank seemed to drag the battle closer, its flat trajectory shells burrowing under embrasures that had once been safe from naval fire. Behind the front, chaos spread through the German command network. Telephone lines were severed by bombardment, and radio frequencies jammed by Allied interference. Requests for reinforcements from the 21st Panzer Division vanished into static. Orders contradicted each other. Some called for counterattack, others for immediate withdrawal. By midday, field commanders no longer fought for the beach. They fought simply to stay alive. In Le Mans, 7th Army headquarters received fragmented reports. Strong enemy armor landed. Beaches penetrated. Situation unclear. No one realized that what they faced was only the vanguard. Hundreds more Shermans were already disembarking from the transport ships offshore. For the defenders staring at the endless grey horizon, the sea itself seemed made of steel. The shock that morning was not just physical, it was psychological. The shattering realization that the Atlantic Wall had met its match. By June 7, 1944, the thunder of naval guns had faded behind the advancing Allied line, replaced by a more intimate kind of war. The Shermans that had crawled from the sea now found themselves in a landscape built for ambush. Normandy's bocage, miles of ancient hedgerows, sunken lanes and stone walls, was a natural fortress. Thick earthen banks rose taller than a man, their roots intertwined with dense brush that concealed movement and swallowed visibility. For tank crews trained on open ground, it was a nightmare. Engines roared, then stalled in ditches. Guns swung blindly toward muzzle flashes that vanished in seconds. German defenders used the terrain with lethal precision. Concealed 88mm guns waited at crossroads, while Panzerfaust teams hid behind hedgerows, firing from just a few yards away. Each field became a killing ground bordered by walls of green. The Sherman's greatest strengths, speed and coordination, were strangled by the terrain. Yet adaptation came quickly. US engineers, improvising in the field, welded steel prongs nicknamed rhinoceros tusks to the fronts of their tanks. These crude but effective attachments allowed the Shermans to punch through hedgerows without climbing over them, keeping their vulnerable undersides hidden from enemy fire. In the narrow lanes near St. Lo, armored platoons learned to fight like infantry, hedge by hedge, field by field. Commanders coordinated closely with foot soldiers, who scouted enemy positions and cleared the paths for advancing armor. Overhead, Allied aircraft prowled the skies, striking at German supply lines and command posts. Despite fierce counterattacks from the 2nd Panzer and 12th SS Hitlerjugend divisions, the Allies' logistical advantage proved decisive. Every destroyed Sherman was replaced within days. Every burned-out wreck was followed by a new machine from across the Channel. The Germans, short on fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, could not match the pace. The Bocage campaign was not a battle of sweeping maneuvers, but of endurance, an education in adaptation and grit. Each breakthrough was paid for in steel and blood, but each also brought the Allies closer to the open plains beyond. Ahead lay Caen, the next great test, and beyond it the chance to break free of Normandy's green walls once and for all. By mid-June 1944, the battle for Caen had become a crucible of steel. The city, vital for its roads and bridges across the Orne River, was supposed to fall on D-Day itself. Instead, it became the center of a grinding struggle between British and Canadian forces and Germany's finest armored divisions, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend and Panzerlehr. The fields south of the city, once bright with wheat, turned into vast arenas of tank warfare. Against the advancing Shermans came the Panthers, sleek and lethal, their long 75mm KWK-42 guns capable of piercing Allied armor from well over a mile away. The clash that unfolded was not just tactical, it was ideological. Precision versus production, power versus persistence. The British had anticipated this duel. Months earlier, their engineers had rearmed the Sherman with the formidable 17-pounder anti-tank gun, creating the Sherman Firefly. Though its tall gun barrel and exposed turret made it easy to spot, it gave the Allies a fighting chance. At ranges beyond 1,500 meters, the Firefly could punch through the frontal armor of a Panther or Tiger, a feat no standard Sherman could achieve. Crews learned to hide their Fireflies among regular Shermans, revealing them only at the moment of engagement. When a Panther exposed its flank or turret, a single well-placed shot from a Firefly could turn the tide of battle in seconds. The fighting around Villers-Bocage and Hill 112 was savage and close. Smoke, dust, and burning crops turned the landscape into a furnace. German tank commanders like Michael Wittmann carved through British columns in ambushes, but even their victories could not stem the flood. For every Sherman that burned, 2 more rolled forward from the beaches. German officers later admitted that Fireflies were the most dangerous enemy tanks they faced in Normandy. Yet even more demoralizing than the weapon itself was what it represented, an enemy that never seemed to run out of men, machines, or resolve. As Caen smoldered under weeks of bombardment, German morale began to erode. The Allies, though bloodied, were learning faster, adapting harder, and preparing for the breakout that would finally shatter the German line. By the summer of 1944, the true weapon of the Allies was not a tank nor a gun, but a factory. Across the Atlantic, American industry had reached a tempo of production that no other nation could match. The vast foundries of Detroit and Cleveland thundered day and night, turning out over 2,500 Sherman tanks each month. Assembly lines moved with such precision that a complete tank could roll out every 20 minutes. Engines from Ford's Highland Park plant, transmissions from General Motors, and turret castings from Lima were all interchangeable, built to exacting standards that made repairs swift and logistics seamless. While German industry struggled beneath the weight of Allied bombing raids, its output crippled by fuel shortages and fractured supply chains, the American machine only accelerated. In France, the newly established Red Ball Express convoys, thousands of trucks manned largely by African-American drivers, kept the front alive. From the beaches to depots near Saint-Lô and Cherbourg, the convoys carried fuel, ammunition and tank parts along roads marked by red circles. The result was a logistical miracle. A damaged Sherman could be repaired within hours, while a Tiger immobilized by a broken gearbox might remain stranded for days, even weeks. Captured intelligence painted a grim picture for German commanders. Reports intercepted by Wehrmacht analysts revealed the scale of Allied replenishment. If half of all tanks in Normandy were destroyed, replacements would arrive within a month. The numbers defied belief and crushed morale. To German soldiers, it seemed that every Sherman they burned was instantly reborn, two more rolling out of the smoke to take its place. What had begun as a contest of tactics was now a war of endurance, and only one side could sustain it. As July approached, Allied armor was fully supplied, fully manned, and poised for the next thunderbolt, a breakout plan called Operation Cobra that would unleash the full might of that unstoppable machine. By late July 1944, Normandy had become a graveyard of wrecked armor and broken hedgerows. For weeks, the Allies had fought yard by yard through the bocage, their advance slowed to a crawl. Then, on July 25th, General Omar Bradley unleashed the operation that would finally break the deadlock, Operation Cobra. The plan was bold and brutal, an overwhelming aerial bombardment to pulverize the German front near Saint-Lô, followed by a lightning-armored thrust that would rip open the western flank. At dawn, the sky filled with the drone of more than 3,000 Allied bombers. Waves of B-17s and B-24s released their payloads in succession, turning the countryside into a rolling sea of fire. The explosions flattened entire defensive lines, silencing guns and cutting communications. When the last echoes faded, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Out of the smoke came the Shermans. Hundreds of them, engines roaring, treads grinding through craters and debris. Against the shattered remnants of the Panzer Division, their advance was relentless. Speed had replaced attrition. Tank columns surged forward under cover of dust and chaos, outpacing German orders and collapsing the defense before it could reform. Infantry rode on their hulls, fanning out to clear bypassed pockets of resistance. The cohesion the Allies had struggled to achieve in the bocage now unfolded with mechanical precision, air, armor, and infantry moving as one. For the Germans, it was a nightmare without pause. Survivors of the bombing described the American assault as a steel storm that did not stop. Communications between units broke down entirely. Counterattacks faltered for lack of fuel and coordination, while the Shermans pressed on, unstoppable, interchangeable, and everywhere. Within 3 days, U.S. forces had advanced more than 20 miles south of Saint-Lô, rupturing the German line and transforming a stagnant front into a rolling offensive. Those who escaped fell back toward Falaise, where retreat would soon turn to annihilation. Normandy was no longer a foothold. It had become a launch point for liberation. The age of the beachhead was over. The race across France had begun, and the Sherman, once forged for endurance, was now the engine of momentum. Inside a Sherman, war was measured not in miles but in inches. The interior was a world of heat, oil, and noise. 5 men sealed inside a steel box that could turn into a furnace in minutes. The air reeked of cordite and gasoline. Every vibration from the engine throbbed through their boots. The space was so cramped that each man's elbow was another's shoulder. The commander peered through his cupola slit, the gunner hunched over the sights, the loader balancing 75mm shells the length of his arm. The driver and co-driver, half blind behind their viewports, steered through smoke and mud they could barely see. Communication was instinctual, a tap on the leg, a shouted number, a curse drowned by the roar of the engine. The tank that had carried them through training was more than a machine. It was home. Crews gave their Shermans names: Thunderbolt, Sweet Sue, Lucky Lady, painted across the hulls in chalk or whitewash. These markings weren't bravado. They were hope. They made the faceless war personal. Soldiers of the 2nd Armored Division wrote of how they spoke to their tanks like living things, urging them to survive another day. They knew their armor was thin. The Germans called the Sherman a Ronson, after the lighter that lights every time. When an 80mm round struck home, the result was often instant fire. Crews carried wet blankets and extinguishers, knowing that seconds could mean the difference between escape and entombment. Yet fear alone could not define them. Brotherhood did. Against panthers and tigers, the Shermans relied on speed, coordination, and trust. While the enemy had thicker steel, the Allies had something harder to break: unity. Each tank crew was a microcosm of the larger war effort, ordinary men bound by purpose, outnumbering and outlasting a foe that underestimated their will. In the din and danger of those battles, they learned the truth of modern war: that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to keep moving inside it. By August 1944, the thunder in Normandy had subsided. The fields once churned by battle were littered with burned-out armor. German Panthers blackened in the ditches beside Shermans that had driven too far, too fast. The campaign that began on June 6th had consumed nearly 400,000 German troops, killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions ceased to exist. To the Wehrmacht, the collapse was more than tactical, it was existential. Reports from surviving officers spoke not of cowardice or surprise, but of exhaustion. "They came like waves unending," one panzer commander wrote, describing the futility of resisting an enemy that seemed to regenerate after every loss. What began as an invasion had become an industrial war of attrition that the Reich was never built to endure. German doctrine had long prized quality over quantity, the precision of the Tiger's optics, the sloped armor of the Panther, the mastery of experienced crews. Yet in Normandy, those virtues were outflanked by something Germany could not replicate: scale. For every Tiger that stalled for lack of fuel, 10 Shermans rolled past it. For every Panther destroyed, replacements arrived faster than reports could be written. Even elite SS divisions, veterans of Russia and Kursk, found themselves encircled by mobile columns they could neither halt nor outrun. Hitler's orders to hold ground at all costs turned his panzers into immobile fortresses, iron monuments to a doctrine that had lost touch with the battlefield's new rhythm. As August faded into September, the Allies rolled through the ruins of the Falaise Pocket, where twisted steel and shattered armor testified to the reckoning. Beyond those wrecks lay Paris and liberation. The Shermans that had crawled ashore through surf and smoke now rumbled down boulevards lined with cheering crowds. Their tracks carried more than men and ammunition. They bore the weight of a new world being reborn, 1 mile at a time. The M4 Shermans story did not end in the fields of Normandy. What began as an answer to a desperate wartime need evolved into one of the most adaptable fighting machines in history. After the battle, as Allied forces pushed through France and into Germany, new variants of the Sherman appeared on every front. Models armed with 76mm high-velocity guns replaced the earlier 75s, offering far greater armor penetration. Some received thicker frontal plating or applique armor welded directly in the field. Others became flamethrower tanks, bridge layers, and armored recovery vehicles. The same chassis gave birth to the M10 and M36 tank destroyers, the M7 Priest self-propelled gun, and even amphibious crab mine flails that cleared paths through minefields. No other tank of the war matched its versatility. Its greatest strength was never invincibility, it was adaptability. Crews could repair, modify, or repurpose their Shermans in days, turning setbacks into solutions. This flexibility mirrored the larger Allied philosophy: coordination over rigidity, cooperation over isolation. German officers later confessed that their armored forces had been drowned under the mass of American production, crushed not only by numbers but by the momentum of a system that learned faster than they could react. For Allied soldiers, the Sherman came to embody confidence itself, a machine that could cross rivers, scale beaches, and keep fighting when logic said it shouldn't. It was proof that persistence could outlast precision. When the war ended, hundreds of Shermans found new homes in armies from Europe to the Middle East, serving on battlefields well into the 1960s. Yet its true legacy was not mechanical, but psychological. The triumph of adaptability over rigidity, of cooperation over obsession with perfection. The spirit forged on D-Day's beaches would define armored warfare for generations to come. The story ends where it began, on the grey beaches of Normandy. The tide that once carried steel and fire now laps gently against sand that hides its secrets. Beneath those calm waves lie the rusted hulks of Sherman tanks, their turrets half buried in silt, their engines long silent. They rest where they fell on June 6, 1944, guardians of a shoreline that once echoed with the thunder of invasion. To the German officers who had watched in disbelief that morning, it was the moment the war shifted beyond recovery. The Atlantic Wall, once proclaimed impregnable, had cracked, not merely in stone but in spirit. For the men inside those Shermans, that day was more than battle, it was endurance given form. Each shell fired, each yard gained through smoke and surf, carried the weight of millions behind it. The factory workers in Detroit, the convoy sailors braving U-boat waters, the mechanics who rebuilt what the front consumed. When the first tank treads bit into Normandy's sand, history itself began to turn. The tide still retreats each morning, leaving faint ripples where armor once crawled ashore. In those marks lies the memory of a truth forged in iron and will. That courage, multiplied by unity and industry, can move even the heaviest of walls. On that day, the sea brought not just soldiers, but liberation itself,